The first night she arrived, the wind howled outside the small wooden cabin like some wild creature searching for a lost prey, rattling the shutters and sending shivers down the spine of the man inside. Jace McAllister, the cowboy, was a figure molded by the harshness of the land, broad-shouldered, hands calloused from years of riding and toil, eyes sharp as the steel he carried, but grief had hollowed him out, leaving him as empty as the fields he rode through each day. He was a man who had learned to keep everything inside, to carry his pain as silently as the saddle carried him across the dusty plains. The quiet of the night was his only companion, until she came, walking through the snow with a resilience that seemed almost impossible. She was not like the others he had known, not like the women who had whispered promises she would later regret or faded away like morning mist. She carried herself with quiet strength, her eyes reflecting a depth of sorrow and hope entwined, and her hair, the color of sun-bleached hay, fell in gentle waves down her back. There was something in her presence that made him tense, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and unspoken recognition of pain familiar to him alone. She did not knock or announce herself with words. She simply entered, and the fire that had been dying low seemed to flicker brighter as though acknowledging her arrival. Her voice, soft and steady, carried no demands, only the promise of safety and understanding. "May I stay for the night?" she asked, not as a plea, but as a quiet question, the kind that already assumed permission. He opened his mouth to refuse, to tell her that solitude was all he had left and that no warmth, no kindness, would find a place in his life. But something in the curve of her lips, the softness in her eyes, made him pause. He said nothing, only motioned to the small cot near the fire, and she placed her pack down, removing her coat to reveal a presence that was both fragile and unyielding, like a flame that refused to be extinguished. When night fell, the cold seeped into the corners of the cabin, wrapping itself around the walls and settling into the cracks of the floorboards. She approached him without hesitation, her body a gentle heat that contrasted with the icy tension coiling inside him. At first, he resisted, stiff and rigid, murmuring about debts owed to the past, mistakes he could never erase, and choices that had left scars deeper than the snow outside. He wanted to push her away, to protect himself from the vulnerability he could feel building with every heartbeat. But the loneliness, the ache of years spent in isolation, gnawed at him like a relentless wolf. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he leaned into her warmth, the friction of her presence against his own awakening something he had long thought dead. Night after night, she stayed, never pressing, never demanding, letting her patience be a quiet testament to endurance and understanding. She listened to the darkness that haunted him, the nightmares that clawed at his chest, and she held him through tremors of fear and flashes of memory he had buried deep. Sometimes, he spoke, sometimes he didn't. Sometimes, he would stare at the ceiling, wrestling with the ghosts of his past, and she would simply lie beside him, letting her presence speak louder than words ever could. Her warmth became a bridge over the chasm of his despair, a light that crept into the frozen spaces he had long thought unreachable. By the 10th night, something had begun to shift. He found himself talking, not about the cattle or the long hours on the trail, but about things he had never dared to voice. He spoke of a love lost too soon, of the regrets that kept him awake under a sky full of indifferent stars, of the choices he had made that led him to a life where death seemed almost a friend. And she listened, never interrupting, never judging, her hand resting on his chest as if to remind him that he was alive, that he was not alone. Her touch was simple, unassuming, yet it carried the weight of reassurance and acceptance he had never known he craved. Her presence brought a rhythm to the nights, a fragile dance of trust and intimacy. Sometimes, their hands would meet in the dark, fingers entwining without the need for words, a silent acknowledgement of connection. Other times, he would wake to find her awake too, staring at the fire, watching the shadows, her gaze distant yet comforting. She never asked for explanations, never sought to unravel the complicated tapestry of his life too quickly. She let him reveal himself piece by piece, as one might slowly uncover a long-buried treasure, careful not to shatter what lay beneath the surface. As the weeks passed, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, brick by brick, each night chipping away at the armor of solitude. He began to notice the little things about her, the way her laughter could brighten the room, the gentleness of her hands as she adjusted the blankets around him, the way she listened not only with her ears but with her entire being. It was in these moments, fleeting yet profound, that he realized her warmth was not merely physical. It was life itself, a steady pulse that reminded him of what he had almost forgotten, that the heart could feel again, that trust could grow even in the coldest soil, that love could exist beyond the pain he carried. There were moments of tension too, nights when his old fears surged and he pulled away, tense and irritable, pushing against the closeness he both craved and feared. She never argued, never pleaded, she simply stayed, her presence an unwavering testament to patience and hope. Sometimes he would awaken from a nightmare to find her holding him, her warmth a lifeline, and he would feel tears he had long denied streaming down his cheeks. In those nights, the cabin was filled not with words but with the quiet rhythm of shared breaths, the subtle language of souls meeting in the dark, fragile yet unbreakable. By the 20th night, Jace began to feel an unfamiliar sensation, trust. It was slow, tentative, like the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon, but it was real. He allowed himself to lean against her, to rest his head on her shoulder without the instinct to flee. And each time he did, each time he let her in, he discovered a fragment of himself he had long forgotten. Laughter returned in small doses, fleeting but genuine, stories of his youth, of dreams he once had, began to escape his lips. And she listened, always listening, never judging, letting him unfold at his own pace. The nights continued, each one a delicate negotiation between vulnerability and fear, warmth and isolation, desire and dread. She stayed, night after night, a constant in a world that had given him nothing but loss. Her touch, her voice, her presence, these became the threads holding him together, weaving a tapestry of hope where once there was only despair. And in the quiet moments, when the fire had died down and the wind whispered outside, he realized, in a way he could scarcely admit even to himself, that he was beginning to care, that he was beginning to feel again, that the cold and darkness he had carried for so long might not be permanent after all. By the 30th night, the warmth she brought was no longer just a comfort, it had become a necessity. It was a tether, a lifeline to the world outside his grief, a reminder that life, no matter how harsh, still had beauty, still had touch, still had love to offer. And though he did not yet know if he was ready to embrace it fully, he could not deny the quiet truth forming in the depths of his heart. She was not just warming his body, she was awakening his soul, and for the first time in years, he dared to hope that he might survive the darkness after all. By the 30th night, the cold that had once seemed to gnaw at every corner of the cabin had become a distant whisper, almost irrelevant compared to the warmth that now filled the space between them. Jace McAllister had begun to feel the subtle, terrifying pull of life again, a sensation he had not allowed himself in years. The woman beside him, Alara, though he rarely spoke her name aloud, had become more than a companion. She was a presence that seeped into his soul, challenging the walls he had spent decades constructing. Every night, she remained beside him without expectation, her body pressed close but never demanding, her hands steady even when his trembled from nightmares or old guilt. And yet, even as the comfort of her presence grew, so did the tension inside him. He was a man caught between two forces, the instinct to retreat into solitude and despair, and the unfamiliar, dizzying desire to reach for something he feared he did not deserve. On the 32nd night, the cabin was quieter than usual. The fire sputtered low, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Alara shifted beside him, resting her head on his shoulder with a quiet sigh that seemed to carry a question he could not yet answer. He felt the weight of her trust pressing against him, as if every heartbeat of hers demanded he choose, to push her away or finally let himself feel. He resisted at first, the old habits of fear and grief tugging at his mind. Thoughts of failure, of inadequacy, of the wrong choices he had made in the past, crowded his consciousness, threatening to suffocate the fragile hope that had begun to bloom. But when he felt her fingers graze his hand, tracing the lines of scars both old and invisible, a strange calm settled over him. It was not comfort, exactly, but a gentle reminder that perhaps he was still capable of love, still capable of being saved from the edge he had skirted for so long. The nights blurred together, each one a delicate negotiation between the past and a future he could not yet imagine. She never asked him to speak of his fears or his losses, but he found himself doing so anyway, drawn out by the warmth of her body and the patience in her eyes. He told her about the woman he had loved and lost, the life he had abandoned after tragedy struck, the mistakes that had driven him into isolation. She listened as if every word mattered, and in her silence, he discovered something he had not felt in years, acceptance. It was not pity, not judgment, just a recognition that he was more than his grief, more than his past, more than the darkness that had defined him for so long. And with each revelation, each confession shared in whispers beneath the low flicker of firelight, the bond between them deepened, threading through their souls in a way neither had anticipated. By the 35th night, Jace began to notice the subtle ways she had changed him. He laughed more easily, the sound rough but genuine, echoing in the cabin like a bird testing its wings. He ate better, slept longer, and even ventured outside during the day, riding through the snow-covered plains with a sense of purpose he had long abandoned. And yet, for all the small victories, fear still lingered. He worried that allowing himself to love her would make him weak, that the walls he had built to protect himself would crumble completely, leaving him vulnerable to pain he was not sure he could survive. He questioned her motives silently, wondering if the patience she offered was a test. Or if perhaps he would fail her in the end. But each time he caught the warmth of her gaze, each time he felt the softness of her hand against his chest, he realized that she was not testing him. She was simply showing him that life, real, messy, human life, was worth embracing again. On the 38th night, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting, shaking the cabin and rattling the windows with icy hands. Jace felt his old instincts flare, the urge to retreat, to shield himself from vulnerability, to hide from the chaos outside and within. Alara moved closer, her body pressing against his, her breath warm against his ear. "You don't have to choose tonight," she whispered, though her words were not a request but a statement of faith in him. He clenched his fists, torn between the pull of the darkness he had known all his life and the unfamiliar light she offered. And yet, even as the storm raged, he felt something stir, a fragile, terrifying courage that told him he could survive this choice, that he could step into life without fear. The 41st night arrived like a slow, deliberate dawn, heavy with anticipation. Jace awoke to the quiet sound of her breathing, her presence as steady as ever, and he felt the full weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could continue to walk the edge of despair, returning to the solitude and numbness that had been his companions for so long. Or he could reach for her, for the warmth that had seeped into his bones over the past 40 nights, and finally allow himself to live. His heart thundered in his chest, the fear and desire intertwining in a knot that refused to unravel. She shifted beside him, eyes soft and patient, waiting, not for him to speak, not for him to explain, but simply for him to choose. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes and remembering all the nights she had stayed, all the times she had held him through the dark, all the moments when her warmth had reminded him he was still alive. He thought of the laughter that had returned, of the quiet conversations by the fire, of the subtle but undeniable truth that life was not meant to be endured alone. And in that instant, something broke inside him, not in despair, not in sorrow, but in the fragile, shattering beauty of release. He opened his eyes, met hers, and felt tears stream down his face for the first time in years, tears that carried both grief and hope, both fear and love. He chose her. He chose life. He chose love. And in that choice, the weight of the past lifted slightly, like a snowdrift finally giving way to the sun. She leaned into him, pressing her forehead to his, and in that quiet, intimate gesture, they both understood the gravity of what had transpired. The cowboy who had once walked along the edge of death now faced a new beginning, one that required courage, trust, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability. And for the first time in decades, he did not feel alone. Morning came, spilling gold light across the cabin and the snow-laden plains beyond. They remained entwined, the warmth between them no longer just physical but emotional, spiritual, a connection forged over 40 nights of patience, understanding, and quiet perseverance. Jace realized that she had not only saved him from the darkness that threatened to consume him but had also taught him the most essential truth of all, that love, in its purest form, was not weakness but strength. And as the sun rose higher, bathing the cabin in light, he made an unspoken vow, to never forget the courage it took to choose life, to hold on to the love that had rekindled his soul, and to walk forward into the unknown with her by his side, knowing that no storm, no grief, no fear could ever pull him back into the shadows again.